Akua here. I also respond to Aqua and Ikea. I'm a certified executive coach, recognized facilitator, and speaker. And I'm really excited to be jumping on today because I'm talking about the importance of workload management. I'm sure a lot of you that are watching this are hopefully either on vacation, going on vacation, have already done vacation. And I think that's why this topic is so important. I mean, it's important in general, but I think it's even more important as so many of us are actually taking a break and so many of us are thinking about, how we can make sure that we're restoring ourselves, we're getting the rest that we need. And I think that this concept of workload management can be incredibly helpful for that. Before we get started, if you haven't had a chance to take a listen to this week's podcast episode, please make sure you do. I'm really, really excited about this week's episode, and I think that it's very much related to this topic today because the amazing woman I speak to actually has several different businesses that she does, all within that same 9 to 5 time period. So she has a regular 9 to 5, and then she also has additional businesses. And she does an amazing job of sort of leveraging her team, leveraging people to support her. She invests in other businesses as well. So if you want to know someone who does a really great job with managing her workload and also being a mother, and dealing with all the crazy traffic in Accra. So she lives in Accra, Ghana. Please make sure you listen to this week's podcast episode. It's a great interview, and I think she's an amazing woman. So let's talk a little bit about the conversation today, which is all about workload management. This conversation really was inspired by a client. So one of my executive clients is going on holiday, I think actually this week. And so some of the conversations we've been having recently have been about how she can make sure she plans for this vacation. So one, she doesn't feel overwhelmed prior to the vacation. And then two, she doesn't feel overwhelmed after the vacation, right? Because for so many of us taking a holiday, that means we come back to chaos, right? That means that we come back and we have to jump back in and things sometimes end up being crazy. This is also inspired by the fact that next week I'm taking a break. So if you are watching this in July or August, I will not be doing live streams during August. I will not be putting out podcast episodes during August, but you will be seeing some content because there's some work that we've been doing in advance to make sure that there is still a bit of content coming out, but there won't be podcast episodes and they will not be live streams as well. So if this sounds interesting to you, if you want to learn a little bit more about what you can do to make sure that you have the best break ever, you don't feel bad or guilty taking a break, and you've also given some thought to how you can make sure that after your break, you also don't feel overwhelmed or burnt out, this is the live stream for you. So let's get into it. Whether or not you're looking to take a break right now, I think that there's two basic questions that you should be asking yourself at all times, right? It doesn't matter if you're a leader, doesn't matter if you're in an entry-level position. These are two questions I think you should be asking yourself all the time. The first thing you should be asking yourself is, what do you have direct control over? Okay, that's really the first question. And the second question you should be asking yourself in relation to your work is, what are the external things that you can try to influence? And I think that these two questions are really key because sometimes when we start thinking about the amount of work that we have to do, if we start feeling overwhelmed or we start feeling like we might be somewhat burnt out, we tend to forget that we don't have complete control over everything that we're doing, especially if we're an employee and especially if we're working within an organization. As someone who works primarily for themselves, I have a little bit more freedom, a little bit more control over things, but some of it still is directed by people externally of me. And so that's why I think these two questions are really key as it relates to thinking about workload management. So one, what do you have direct control over? And we'll talk a little bit about this in a second. And then two, what are external things that you can try to influence, right? And why am I thinking about these questions before I actually get into a definition of workload management? I'm thinking about these definitions because first and foremost, as human beings, we have a natural optimism bias for how long things will take. So we typically are quite positive and quite optimistic, and we tend to plan for things to take shorter periods of time, and things tend to take much longer. This is especially a problem when we're delegating work or things are due in the future, or, right, we've hired potentially an expert to support us. We think that things take less time. And in reality, most things take longer than we think they do. And that's why it's so important for us to think about what do we have direct control over and what are external things that we can influence. All right. The second thing I think that's incredibly important to keep in mind, especially as it relates to workload management within an organization or company, is that a lot of times people who are making decisions about the time, energy, and the resources required to do something are usually very far removed from the work that actually needs to be done. So let me break that down for a second. What that means is if you're listening to this and you're a decision maker or you're a leader or you're a CEO or you're a founder, right? A lot of times you are making decisions or supporting others with setting expectations that you, one, have not done yourself. So it's a role or task you don't have a direct connection with. You haven't done it yourself. Or if you have done it, you have not done it recently, right? And so you might not be aware of how long something takes, or you might also potentially be someone who's somewhat of an expert at it. So for you, it takes, not as much time. And so you make this assumption, or you have a story you tell yourself where, hey, this person I've delegated to, or this person I'm setting expectation for should be able to do it within a shorter period of time than I perceive, right? A shorter period of time based on my expectations, based on what I think it should take. Really just recognizing that this is typically a mistake and this is a story we tell ourselves. And this is also something that I need to keep in mind as I delegate work to others as well. And so as you become more and more removed from the work that you're delegating, from working with experts who might have a better understanding of how to do something, it's really important that you recognize that we have this natural innate bias to say, hey, something is not going to take as long as we think it should. And making sure that we're making allowances for that, right? And that's why workload management is so very important, because we typically are very unrealistic with distributing and managing work for both ourselves and others, right? So this bias that we have is not just about for others. It's actually a lot easier for us to do it for others, but it's also for ourselves. We tend to assign ourselves way too much work within the time period that we actually want to set for the work that we need to get done. Okay, so let's actually define what workload management is. So I got this definition from online. I think it's a great definition to start with, but workload management is the process of distributing and managing your work across your team and also for yourself. If this is done correctly, what this means is that your employees are able to perform, right? You're able to perform. People don't feel overwhelmed. There's not chaos, and everyone feels satisfied at the end of the day rather than overwhelmed. And this is a key piece and why I always talk about productivity being very closely related to our emotions and how we feel, right? Because what one person can do in a day, what you, right, as a leader or a founder or a CEO can do during a day is very different from somebody else's, right, capacity. So really just recognizing that this idea of workload management is really being able to both make sure that, that person is getting all those things done, where those expectations are, but there's also this element of them feeling satisfied, right? Feeling like, yeah, I've done a great job, right? As opposed to, hey, oh my gosh, this was crazy. Like, I don't think I can do this again. So workload management, it's really about making sure that people feel satisfied. I think that's a really good sort of way to think about how that individual, right, or you're supposed to feel at the end of the day. Not overwhelmed, not feeling like you're a chicken with his head cut off, right? Firefighting, you feel satisfied. And let me just note that every single day, you're not necessarily going to feel satisfied, but I do think that's a really good indicator. And recognize, I haven't said that there's a specific number you should be looking for, or a certain number of things that you should check off your list, because every single day is going to look really different, right? And that's why, once again, this idea or this concept of workload management is so key. And I think it's incredibly key as we are thinking about setting expectations. So when I think about workload management, and I also think about this particular client that inspired this live stream, it's really important to recognize that you, right, especially if you're an employee and somebody else is delegating to you or somebody else is supporting you and setting expectations, can be as resilient as you want. But if you work within an organization or you run an organization that doesn't give realistic and achievable timelines or expectations, not only are you going to burn out and be upset and annoyed, but everybody working for you is going to be burnt out and annoyed as well, because you are not setting the workload efficiently and effectively. Okay, so why is this important? This is important because we are not robots. We are human beings. And so for us to be able to do a good job, for our employees to feel engaged and motivated, And I mentioned this a little bit before. This is unique sort of balance, right? It's a bit of an art and a science that we need to make sure that we are covering. And this is why it's so important that we engage with members of our team. And it's so important that we engage with ourselves as well, because just checking things off a checklist is not good enough, right? So it's important that everyone, including yourself, understands, what does this role demand? What does this mean for us intellectually? What does this, impact on us emotionally? And do we feel satisfied, right? Going back to this concept of satisfaction as well, right? So recognizing that it really includes all these elements, right? What does the actual role require? And I'll talk a little bit about how we talk about realistic and achievable, but what does this role actually require? Right? Do we have the capacity, right? The intellectual, the mental, emotional capacity, right? What does that demand as well? Because some jobs are actually more emotionally and mentally demanding than others. We don't always think about it that way, but it's true. Not all jobs are created equal. Not all roles are created equal, just like not every single day is equal and it's going to look a little bit different. And what does that mean for that job satisfaction at the end of the day? Okay. And this is, once again, so incredibly important. And it's really important that we're engaging with ourselves and we're engaging with others. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier on, sometimes those you delegate work to, sometimes those that are supporting you, right, are not always the ones directing the timelines. But it's very important that you include them in setting your timeline so that you make sure that your timelines and expectations are achievable and realistic. Okay. So how do we figure out whether or not things are achievable and realistic? And once again, this is going to look different for every single person, right? So if you run a team, you have 5 people that you're managing, it's important that you do some level of this activity that I'm going to share in a second with members of your team. I'd recommend that you start with it first, just so that you see how this can really help you with this concept of workload management. So what I really would love for you to do, right, if you're listening to this, if you're listening to the replay, you can pause it and continue listening. But what I really would love for you to do, when I have it written down, that's why I'm looking down because I have notes, is I'd love for you to write down everything that you wanted to do today. Everything. And if you feel like your day's already over, you can think about everything that you need to do tomorrow. Write down everything. Okay. Just a brain dump. I love calling it a brain dump. I actually have a resource on my website if you're interested. If you go to my website and just search a brain dump, it'll come up with this activity. So you can continue doing it if you want a little bit of guidance. But just write down everything you need to do today, or if you prefer thinking about tomorrow, everything you need to do tomorrow. If you're doing this with a member of your team, have them write down everything that they think they need to do. Okay. Then what I want you to do is to take out your calendar or your schedule if you have a planner, right? I then want you to give everything that you've written down on your list, and you can break it up if you want to into things for your business or things for your company or organization or your career versus things in your personal life. You can break it down that way if you like. Personally, I like to integrate the two because I think the two, we're human beings, and I think that both of them are really important. But for this exercise, if you want to break it down into those two pieces, go ahead and do that. And then what I'd like you to do is assign just 1 hour to each one of those projects or tasks. And this is a key thing here. I actually like to break down projects into tasks, but for this particular exercise, you can just give 1 hour for each project or task, whatever you have on that list. Okay. After you've given everything on your list, 1 hour, or you do this with a member of your team and they've given everything on that list that they have that they need to do within that day, right? 1 hour. I'd love for you to reflect on how many things you have on that list. Okay. So if you've put 8 things on that list, each of the things on the list takes 1 hour. That's 8 hours of your time. That already is unrealistic. You're not going to be able, even if you only did minimum 30 minutes. Sometimes I love to do this with clients and I just say, hey, just put 30 minutes by everything and then try and put that in your calendar. For the majority of us, there's going to be way too many things on our list even to do or even to allocate 30 minutes to that thing, right? That task or that project, whatever it is, right? So my hope is that this activity shows you straight off the bat that you're incredibly unrealistic about the things that you want to do and accomplish within one day. And so what that means is, especially if we're a leader, if we're being unrealistic, a lot of times we're also very unrealistic with others as well. And so this is just a starting point to help you see what you can actually do within a day. And that's why this concept of achievable and realistic is so important as it relates to workload management, because typically the workload we're giving ourselves and giving others is way too much. Okay. If you are an employee or you have a board that you have to report to or an executive or an investor to report to, right? That might be coming up, right? Hey, all these other people, external partners, external stakeholders are coming at me. Like, how can I make sure I do a better job with my workload management, recognizing that I don't work in a vacuum? Because even I, as someone who's pretty much a solopreneur, I don't work in a vacuum. There's other people I work with. So how can I make sure, right? What is that way forward for me and the things I need to keep in mind? All right. So I have some ideas on how to do that. And I also just want to make sure that everyone knows, if you haven't actually heard about this, that I actually do have a quiz that I think does a really great job of helping you think about what are some of the first steps that you can take based on where you are, right? And I definitely think that all of us are kind of on this spectrum, and depending on where we are, how we feel, our health for that day, whether or not we've eaten, right? We can be at a different point, right? We really can be leading or we can be lagging. And I think that my quiz really helps with helping you think through where I should focus in terms of focusing on that workload management piece. So I'll get to that in a second. But in terms of thinking about those two questions, and I actually started off this live stream with those two questions, right? So that first question, and I'm just going to scroll up to it to make sure I get it right, is what do I have direct control over that can help you work through your, workload management? And the second question around what are the external things that you can try and influence? So let's break that down a little bit before we talk about what that might look like for where you are on that spectrum. So in terms of asking yourself of what are the things that you can directly control, I always love to help people think about or suggest that people Google something called that circle of control versus circle of concern, right? So the reality is that we can only control but so much. So what are the things that we can control, right? Every single day. If you Google this, you'll find some really simple things where it's around, you can control your attitude, you control your effort, you can control your actions and habits. And that's this key piece that I really want to narrow down into, because as we talk about actions and habits, what we can actually control are the boundaries that we set for ourselves and the boundaries that we set for others. And that's why when we are thinking about taking a break or a holiday, it's so important that we make sure that we do that. And we're thinking about it in advance and we're communicating it to others, right? So we communicate to others, hey, I'm taking a break here. We communicate to others, hey, this is my, my day off, or hey, I stop work at 5:30. All of those are things that can really help you to control the amount of work that you're doing. And hopefully you work within an environment where these are things that are respected. So once again, earlier on, I talked a little bit about how you can be as resilient as you want, but if you work within an organization that's constantly overstepping your boundaries, especially if they're incredibly reasonable, you might want to ask yourself, is that the place you really see yourself long-term? That might not be a place you last long-term because you're constantly going to be burnt out if you're not able to set those boundaries and actually, make sure you're able to acknowledge those boundaries and actually live those boundaries. All right. Another thing that you can directly control is asking for help. So if you're thinking to yourself, there's way too many things on my plate, one thing you can do is communicate that, right? And making sure that you ask for help. You can't control whether or not someone actually supports you. So we're going to get to the point of influence and why this concept of influence is very important, but you can at least ask for help. Okay. So that first step in thinking about workload management is really getting clear on what are the things that you can directly control, right? And recognizing that we don't work in a vacuum. So it's important that, whatever environment that you're in, that you're reflecting on, does this environment, enable me? Is this environment the best space I can be in? And if it's not, you then want to ask yourself, what are the things that I can influence, right? You can talk to your employees. You unfortunately can't force them to do anything. So that's why this concept of influence and engagement becomes incredibly important, right? So if you do need to ask for help and you need better support, right? Making sure that you delegate better, right? Making sure you're bringing your employees along can make that concept or this idea of workload management so much easier. Another thing that you can influence are your supervisors or your investors, making sure once again that everyone's on the same page, you're communicating with them, and you're making sure that the timelines and deadlines that are being set are achievable and realistic as well, right? So as things are written down, as expectations are being set, right, as contracts are being written, it's very important that you're checking in with yourself and you're asking yourself those questions around those workload management pieces I talked about before, right? And if something needs to be changed or shifted or updated, you're communicating that as well. You're not telling yourself that story like, hey, I'm a failure, or hey, like I need to stay up 5 days in a row in order to get this done. Once again, there might be situations where you have to do that, but for the majority of us and for a lot of us that are doing, different types of work, we don't work within emergency situations. We don't work within situations where things maybe always have to be done at a specific time. So it's very important that you're communicating that expectations or deadlines need to change as well. All right. So if anyone has any questions about that, you're welcome to leave a comment in the chat. You're welcome to also reach out in the DMs. But I just felt like those were some important concepts to talk through before I talked a little bit about some of the things that you can think about. All right. So with this last bit of this live stream, what I wanted to talk a little bit about are some of the things that you can keep in mind depending on where you are within that spectrum of leading or lagging, right? And once again, at any point in time, all of us can be within the spectrum. We can go from leading to lagging, right? We can go from lagging to leading. It's really just going to depend on where we are and how we're using our resources, where we are mentally, physically, and emotionally. But I think it's really important to think about it as a spectrum because that's really going to help us think about what are the resources that we need to be able to move forward, right? How can people support us? Where should we focus in terms of what we can control? Where should our focus go in terms of influence? Okay. And as I mentioned before, this correlates really nicely with the free quiz that I have on my website. So you can just check out www.akuanm.com/quiz if you want to take this quiz, and also think about some of the resources that you can leverage immediately in relation to this quiz. So on one end of the spectrum, right, if you're a leader that is leading, right, another way to think about this is if you're a leader that's for the most part thriving, you're able to be proactive, right? You're probably doing a pretty good job of managing your stress levels. But maybe where you want to focus is how you can really leverage others, right? So if you're maintaining your stress levels, you feel really good about your calendar and your schedule. Are you making sure that you're doing the same thing for the people that are supporting you within your personal and your professional life, right? You want to make sure that you can continue to maintain those boundaries, and you want to make sure that you're showing up with others. So the key here is that you want to make sure that you're constantly refining how you operate so that you can leverage others. And that's really about engaging. So if you feel like you're doing a really good job with your schedule, you feel like for the most part that you're thriving and being proactive, the key here is that you want to make sure that you engage, right? So that you have, right, the bandwidth to continue to do this, right? To continue to make sure that you can see when you're not feeling so hot. So maybe you need to take some time for yourself so that you have the bandwidth to support others in your personal, professional life and constantly be able to show up. So that's the first type of leader, right? Really all the way on the more leading, more proactive side, right? And once again, at any point in time, you might be proactive or you might end up in that reactive piece. So it's really about making sure that you have the bandwidth to even recognize that you're headed towards the reactive element. Okay, in the middle, and this is what I call the treading water leader. So you kind of are aware, right? Hey, I know what it's like when I'm, being proactive. I also know what it's like when I'm being reactive, and I'm somewhere in the middle, right? So what you're doing in the middle is that you're trying to make the most of your personal, your professional life, and you really want to make sure you're taking care of your work responsibilities, but you also recognize it's very important to take care of your personal, your emotional, your mental, and your physical self as well, right? And so that's what I call more of the treading water leader. You're starting to recognize and realize like, hey, so there's something maybe not going as right in my personal life potentially, right? And you kind of feel like you're on a hamster wheel, right? And so the key here is that you want to continue to cultivate your self-awareness so you can call that out to yourself. And you make sure that you're setting boundaries so that you're able to do the most at work, but you're also making sure that you're taking care of your personal life as well. All right. So that's the treading water leader. And the last leader is what I call more of that reactive leader. You might be a bit more on the lagging side. It might also be described as on the brink, right? And you probably are working incredibly hard. All these leaders are working incredibly hard, but you might starting to feel burnt out, and you're aware that something needs to shift, right? And if you don't do something now, you really might have to take time off. You might end up in the hospital, right? You might end up, biting someone's head off because so many things are stacking up and there's so much happening. So it's really important to, one, ask yourself like, hey, am I connected to what I'm doing? Right? Is there some mismatch here between the roles and responsibilities I have and it's not really motivating me and I don't feel really good about it? Because a lot of times burnout is actually feeling apathetic towards what you're doing and not really having that connection to it. That might be one part of it. The second part of it might be like, hey, I don't actually have the support I need, right? So in terms of workload management, like I have way too much to do. And I thought I could do this all by myself, but I really can't. So I need to make sure that I am setting better expectations for myself, right? Setting those boundaries, right? Recognizing I can't do it all by myself and I need some support. Right. And so that's really that on the brink leader or that reactive leader, or if you feel like you're lagging, the key here is that you need to overhaul your expectations so you can improve your performance as a leader. Right. And you can also make sure you're delegating appropriately to others as well. Okay. So those are the three types of leaders that I just wanted to share. And once again, it really relates to this, leadership quiz that I have on my website that you should definitely check out. If you feel like you're having an issue with leading versus lagging, if you feel like every single time you're on a real high that you end up really low, pretty fast, there might be some opportunity here to focus on workload management and really just recognizing that once again, as a leader, you can't do it by yourself. You really need to make sure that your stakeholders in both your personal and your professional life are supporting you so that you feel like you can go from being reactive to really proactive. All right. Once again, if you have any questions about this, you can feel free to reach out, feel free to leave me a comment, or you can also reach out in the DMs. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to listen. Just to reiterate, I will not be going live and I also will not be sharing my podcast, at least for the next 4 weeks or so. So just keep that in mind. If you are like, wait, what happened? I'm taking a break. And I'm also going to be working on some of the new things that are going to be coming out in the last quarter of this year. So just thank you so much for taking the time to listen. Make sure that you take a listen to this week's podcast episode. I think that we do talk a little bit about workload management if you want to hear it from the perspective of someone who has both a 9 to 5 as well as multiple businesses on the side as well. So as always, stay safe and stay sane. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen. Bye.